Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Afternoon. I'm Lloyd Anderson, President of City Club. Welcome to our program today. Today we're going to focus on our Congress and the adoption of our national budget. Here to give the inside story is Congressman Earl Blumenauer. New members today are Gerald Block, psychiatrist in private practice. Pleased to have you. And Jennifer Cooperman. Jennifer is the former Deputy Superintendent for New York State Insurance Department. Friday on October the 15th, join us for a special program featuring our own past president and longtime club member, Charlie Hinkle. Charlie will address the subject of e-commerce and the First Amendment. Please join us for what will be an outstanding presentation. It'll be at the Hilton Hotel. Please note the change in location. All of you have received a letter requesting your support for this year's annual fund. Our goal for this millennium year is $100,000. You have a chance to have your gift doubled this year. A President's Challenge gift in the amount of $3,500 has been established to match every new gift of $25 or more. We're pleased to announce that we're nearly half the way on the match. Please help us reach our goal. On October 14th, the club will host its first open house of the year at the club office. Join us for an opportunity to hear about club events, meet and talk with fellow members, and enjoy late refreshments. If you plan to attend, please RSV Winnie Kane at the club office. Our board host today, seated at the head table, is panel member Les Swanson, second vice president of the club and attorney in private practice. He will ask the first question of our speaker. Following Les' question, we'll open up the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part because of corporate underwriting from Providence Health Plans, U.S. Bank, and Washington Mutual Savings. We're very grateful for their support. The communication between Congress and the President over the annual budget has many of the earmarks of NASA's communication with Lockheed over the disastrous flight of the Mars satellite. One message was in feet and the other in meters. The difference is that the President and Congress each know each other's language. I suppose the question is, does the general public? Maybe the budget needs to disappear behind Mars like the satellite did. We're seeing spin doctoring at its finest. Many of us yearn for the green eye shade accountant that can give us a few unvarnished facts. Hopefully a lot of the posturing gives the folks back home an idea of who ought to be president and who ought to run Congress a year and a quarter from now. The intrigue, the maneuvering, the deal making is right up Earl Blumenauer's alley. He's been an elected official for the last 28 years as a state legislator, a member of the Board of County Commissioners of Multnomah County, as a city councilman of Portland, and now as our congressman from the 3rd District. Earl has run for office a lot and successfully. In addition to running for office, Earl is a long-distance runner. But Earl couldn't make it to the last Portland Marathon, so he arranged to run it the next day. Witnesses and all. It's the only time he's run last in recent memory. Earl, it's nice to have you back at the City Club. Welcome, Earl Blumenauer.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. It has been my distinct pleasure over the years to have opportunities to share with you thoughts and observations about community and national events. I hearken back to the first presentation I made as a member of the City Council, and I think it was the first time I had one of these odd little placemats. That time we were looking at what the vision of the region's transportation system would be 20 years out. And I was pleased to watch over the years as some of the things that we talked about and thought were a little bit visionary at the time have actually been accomplished, and in many cases much faster than we thought. Well, the luck of the placemat has happened again today. I was prepared to talk about the budget impasse in Washington, D.C., the meltdown and the train wreck. But instead, I can announce to you that it has, in fact, been solved. I have Congressman Dave Obey's press release that I picked up just as I got on the plane last night to come back. And Obey, who was the last chair of the Appropriations Committee for the Democrats, is the ranking Democrat now, has decided to throw in the towel and accept the Republican alternative, sparing us the specter that we saw last time. The Republican alternative that Obey has accepted is the creation of the 13th month. Dave is quite excited about this. First of all, it means that he's 8% younger. He feels that it has tremendous benefits as well for his Republican friends, some of the conservatives that are tying things in knot, because by making the 13th month scheme retroactive, Ronald Reagan will be president. It will be 1984 all over again. It has an opportunity to revitalize the retailers around the country, because there will be 30 more shopping days before Christmas. For those of you who are baseball fans and were disappointed that Sammy Sosa and Mark McGwire didn't quite make it in breaking the home run record again, there are 30 more days in the season. And of course, those of you who are concerned about the millennium bug can rest easy, because with the change to the 13-month calendar, we have prolonged the problem. It'll be 10 years before the year 2000 comes about. And finally, it has proved, according to David, that the middle-aged critics of Galileo were correct when they denied his theory that the Earth circled the sun once every 12 months. Thus, they can join the Kansas City School Board and help turn back the clock. The question before us now is what to call the 13th month, and I thought it was unfair that some people wanted to name it after Senator Alan Specter. Spectober, I thought was a little unfair to him and not really showing much in imagination. There was a contest in the Washington Post to be able to really come up with some great names, and they've done it. Delay Pro, Voodoo Ober, Academber, Payupuary, Pinocchioary, and be very, very wary. Suffice it to say that the budget impasse, I'm afraid, has not been broken, and notwithstanding the humor, it isn't really that funny. And although it was on the bottom front page of the Wall Street Journal today with one of the humorists in Washington, D.C., it actually is attributed to my friend Barney Franks, and it was one of the first things that I heard to explain this annual ritual when I went to Congress. This is the fourth time I've watched it. And Barney said, "Earl, this is Washington, D.C., where there's smoke, there's mirrors." I went to Congress with the expectation that the federal government could, in fact, be a better partner to local government, to private business, to individuals, in helping make our communities more livable. Families healthy, economically secure, and safe. And that requires our being able to use our financial resources prudently. We're in the midst of a self-imposed fiscal straitjacket, the result of what was called the Balanced Budget Agreement of 1997. Some of you know that I voted against it at the time, in part because I felt that Congress had no intention of making draconian budget cuts on the order of magnitude of 20% for things like Social Security Administration and veterans programs. At the same time, they were ramping up spending right before an election. It is not just, I'm afraid that those projections that I had became true. They were actually, they've proven to be worse than I thought. First and foremost, the process that we're going through right now distorts the current budget spending. And I don't want to get bogged down in details now, but it's something that we can do at a later point. But those of you who've gone to our national parks, who've looked at cutbacks in areas dealing with health, with the environment, know that there are things right now that are in fact being shortchanged. It squanders long-term opportunities for reform, especially in areas of international programs, Medicare, and Medicaid. It has prompted people to maneuver for a tax cut at this point instead of when the economy might really need it, and with some severe potential consequences. We've heard, for example, from Alan Greenspan that the Fed would in fact raise interest rates if we had an ill-timed tax cut at this point. And finally, we see an orgy of very strange, unusual, special interest spending programs that are able to snake their way through this process. And perhaps most serious of all, I think, is that it further erodes public confidence in the leadership potential of government to deliver the products that the public wants. Sadly, that erosion of public confidence is visited most often at the local level and at the state level, where we see voters taking out their frustration and betraying their frustration at areas where they can vote against levies and imposing draconian tax limitations when they can't, when it's really the federal government that they're more frustrated with. The response of the Republican majority that's currently in charge of Congress needs to be carefully examined. And I want to state from the outset, and I think many of you know, I am not a fiercely partisan animal. And I will say from the outset that both parties, over the course of the last 30 years, have contributed to this gaming of the budgetary system. But the current leadership now in Congress, I think, has carried this to new heights or depths, depending on your perception. It's interesting that Governor Bush, the current Republican frontrunner for the presidential nomination of the Republicans, who has the endorsement of over 2/3 of my Republican colleagues, this last week has been distancing himself, indicating that he didn't think the budget should be balanced on the backs of poor people, and questioning the priorities. One of the most serious and I think ill-advised proposals that came within an eyelash of actually being approved was to take the earned income tax credit, a proposal that came from the Reagan era of government, to encourage working poor families to continue working and to smooth their way, to, in effect, take $8 billion of savings out of that instead of giving them the money back, spreading it out over the next 12 months and into the next fiscal year. In Oregon, that would have impacted 205,000 families, taken over $84 million out of their pockets. And these are people who on average, and you've got some of the data before you, are trying to survive on $15,000 a year to raise a family. I didn't hear any proposals to spread out payments to defense contractors or to take the massive tax cuts and spread those out, or maybe keep the tax refunds from those parts of our society that are doing very well. They wouldn't have to have had much of a delay in the money to them to have made up $8 billion. The list of gimmicks is long as it is creative. We were going to spend farm aid faster, getting it out the door, an extra $5 billion, so it would count in this year's budget. Spread out, forward funding it was called, like the Earned Income Tax Credit and some others, so it would fall into the fiscal year 2001, which, of course, Congress has done for years. But just one bill, the HHS bill, would have forward funded more than Congress has ever done in its history. And of course, this is money that counts against the budget caps in the next year, compounding the problem. I do want to reference for a moment the tax cut. I think that there are many times and occasions when adjustments need to be made in the tax structure. And I think we could sit down right now and come up with 4 or 5 things that would make a big difference for Americans today. And there may well be a time in the future when our economy is stalled and we'll want to have a significant tax cut, like we've done in the past, to help rev things up. Now simply is not that time. And the proposal that was crafted was a scattershot proposal that really didn't speak to, I think, a number of the priorities that Americans would have for adjusting the tax system. But it's interesting that the American public is not today clamoring for a massive tax cut. I read a report on the plane coming out last night, a survey of Republican voters that have their number one budget priority, investment in education. The second was a tax cut, but it was closely followed by paying off the national debt. And these are Republican voters. The problem with the tax cut slipping through the way that it did, in addition to being ill-timed and ill-directed, is that it becomes a grab bag for the special interests. Nothing against special interests, if we happen to be one of them, I suppose. But there were 138 provisions that were shoehorned into that bill. Things like tax breaks for chicken manure, for energy processing, redefining the holding period for racehorses, for capital gains. Things get wedged in there that really would not stand on their own, and by the definition of most of what I think people want to have happen fiscally, really were not priorities. My colleague Tom Davis, who's the Republican campaign chair for the House, was at least candid on the front page of the Wall Street Journal last week when he said at least we got lots of campaign contributions out of it. But it's not a very good way to frame tax policy. It is also prompting a number of ill-advised spending decisions. Because when you have a non-functional budget process, what that does is force this into the back room. It elevates the influence of a handful of people who are going to be there, who have the levers of power, One of my favorite examples is the mini aircraft carrier that the Navy doesn't even want, that Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, because it's going to be manufactured in his state, has succeeded in getting over $300 million of the $500 million that he wanted to be inserted. I don't want to flog this, but I could go on literally for the next half hour with specific examples, some far afield, some close to home. I had to vote a couple weeks ago against subsidies for Oregon dairy farmers to prop up a system of dairy supports that dates back to the Depression, when local dairy supplies were critical. But today, when you can get fresh Maine lobster in restaurants downtown, it doesn't seem to make sense to me to spend $500 million propping up a commodity that is based on how far it's produced from Racine, Wisconsin. The facts about our current situation, I tried to distribute as best I could, just some context for this. And I don't want to go into it in great detail, but I think it's important to bear in mind that as far as industrialized countries are concerned, the United States has one of the lowest tax burdens. Now, it still may be too high, it may be too low, but we need to know where it is in relation to our competitors, for instance. We have problems in this state with people misrepresenting the facts. I got a magazine that talked about how Oregon, one of my friends from the Oregon Tax Research, Oregon was one of the high-tax states, and how this guy couldn't hold his head up when he went to national conferences of other tax activists around the country. It didn't square with what my memory was, so I checked with the legislative research to try and find out where he got the 6th or 7th place ranking. And in fact, Oregon is in the bottom third of the country in terms of the taxes that we raise. Income, property, cigarette tax, you lump them all together, and I think we're 37th out of the 50 states. What our friends had done was tie in other areas of federal spending where we've been creative and effective in getting some extra federal money, and it adds in the goofy things that we do in this state to make up for an inadequate tax system. We take an awful lot of money out of the hands of people via liquor taxes, cigarette taxes, and the lottery that distort the spending patterns. But if we were to base state tax policy on not the level of taxation, but the level of current income that we get, and freeze that into the Constitution, as some of the tax advocates are proposing again for Oregon, another round of initiatives, then if Oregonians came to their senses and stopped drinking and stopped smoking and stopped gambling, and if the federal government maybe was capped and had to be a little less generous with us, then we would have been caught by a fiscal trap of our own making based on inadequate and, I think, misleading information. The public has good instincts in terms of their priorities and their activities. As you can see before us, there are a number of people who are simply not sharing in the economic boom. In fact, the people in the bottom 40%, over 400,000 Oregon families, have seen their incomes actually decline in the midst of this 20-year boom. And in the bottom fifth, it's declined 9%. So we need to place in mind what these impacts are going to be. We are not well positioned for the inevitable economic downturn. We don't have a rainy day fund on the state level, most local levels, and I see some of my colleagues here from City of Portland, Charlie, we have some prudent reserves. We've got a good policy for the City of Portland. But frankly, the way that we have made our local revenue system so closely tied to the changes in the economic cycle, I'm not certain even the very prudent reserve policy that the city has is going to cushion us for more than a couple years if we're in a sustained downward spiral. And last but not least, we are putting off the day of reckoning with the reductions that are going to, or the adjustments that are going to have to be made in some fashion to deal with the impacts of Medicare and Social Security. The little chart that I passed out demonstrates that those two items are the top and the fourth items in the budget, overall budget, and they're going up. Depending on how you're going to cast the assumptions, reasonable assumptions suggest that by 2030, the so-called Social Security Trust Fund will be more than 5% in deficit of the GDP. And that for Medicare, which increasingly is in the lives of more and more Americans, and not just the elderly, but many families are dealing with that now to help cushion the impact for their grandparents and parents, that trust fund goes negative in 5 years and again will be a significant insolvency by 2010. It takes time to readjust massive, controversial, and expensive programs like that. And so why 2010 or 2030 sounds like it's a long way out, it isn't. And each year of delay makes the problem more difficult. I have some predictions. I'm afraid there will be another budget train wreck over the course of the next couple weeks. Government will continue to be functional. I don't think there will be a shutdown like we had before. I think people have learned their lesson in that regard. I do feel that my friends in the Republican Party will look bad, maybe a little worse. I think the President will get more of what he wants, and he and the Democrats may look a little better by comparison. But the price of that agreement is going to be some very bad budget compromises that will result in a number of legislative insiders and special interests getting disproportionate benefit out of this settling. And I think there will be a significant lost opportunity for the American public to be able to take advantage of the best economic times in our lifetime, unprecedented prosperity and optimism, to actually do something to solve these problems and provide what Americans say their priorities are. I would suggest that there are two areas that we ought to proceed to change this, and it's something I'm personally committed to working on in Congress, and would hope that we can energize more people to approach these two areas. One is that we have to perform wholesale surgery on the budget process itself. It has to be opened up. It cannot be hidden from public view. It cannot be done on the cheap. I've shared with some of you my frustration last year at this time being given a budget bill that was 2,714 pages long at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in time for a 7 o'clock vote that evening. Nobody in America knew what was in that bill. And we simply, as Americans, cannot tolerate the process to operate that way. I think the media needs to place a higher priority on what's going on in the budget. It's tough to make it come alive, and we've talked about that. But if they don't, we're all going to be the losers. I think those of us who are compulsive joiners, we're part of I don't know how many groups and organizations, we ought to go through that list and maybe push back a little bit on business groups, civic organizations, advocacy, to have them place budget process at a higher level of their priority for government. I think unions and corporations that think they have more important legislative priorities than how the budget works are wrong. And though they may risk offending a few people, by pushing back, and there may be some corporate or union interests that get pinched a little bit. I think in the long run, their members, their shareholders, the environment in which they work will be infinitely, infinitely stronger. We need to look at a couple of very specific areas and put our focus on, first of all, the military. We have eliminated a great deal of military spending. As a percentage of our gross domestic product, military spending has gone down dramatically. But it should have gone down dramatically. We were spending at an extraordinary level, and because we were sort of doing it quickly and lots was going on and it was sort of an urgent sense, we weren't spending very cost effectively. And I take my hat off to former Congressman Denny Smith, with whom I had an occasional philosophical disagreement. But Denny was one of the budget hawks as it related to military. They were cheap hawks. And it was a bipartisan group, and they performed a tremendous service by focusing on the problems of military procurement and operations. And we need to reinvigorate that effort. Right now, we have over 100,000 troops in Germany. World War II is over now. Berlin Wall has collapsed. We want them to spend more. It's lunacy to have this degree of investment of American military overseas in Europe at this point, costing a huge amount of money, when we can't afford to take care of the men and women in uniform right now, and some of them are on food stamps, and they're in appalling situations. And we're not stepping up in areas where our military really needs to be. And of course, because we have over 100,000 in Europe, we have to have 100,000 in the Asian theater. Not just the people in Korea, but scattered about. We are maintaining more than we need, and they're not where they need to be. We need to be much more sensible about things like the NATO expansion. We backed into a NATO expansion. I think the policy, when we're trying to embrace and encourage democracy in the former Soviet Union, to sort of add unwittingly additional countries to NATO, I'm not certain that's the way to foster the best relationships with the Soviet Union, with Russia. But we certainly didn't deal with the costs, the financial costs that were associated with it. We have $350 billion on the table now to build not one, not two, but 3 tactical jet aircraft, when there is nobody in the world that can compete with us for any one of them. There's an estimate that's been made, if the escalation in the costs of the F-22 continue, the federal budget in 8 years will be consumed by the purchase price of just one of those planes. The F-22 is going to be $200 million per plane. The pro-military leadership in the Appropriations Committee, Military Appropriations Committee, Jack Murtha, an ex-Marine, gruff, wants to spend money on a stronger America, and Jerry Lewis from Southern California, these guys stood up and said, no, pull the plug on this turkey. Maybe we can afford 2. We don't need 3. One other point, and I don't want to belabor this, but we need to take a careful look at our investment in the international arena. We have spent, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, notwithstanding all the notoriety recently about maybe some IMF money that may have been misappropriated and this and that and the other thing in the Russian mafia, we have spent $7.2 billion since 1991 to try and transform a country that was our enemy into a friend and a democracy. After World War II, the United States, having gone through the Great Depression, having had to spend its treasure and human resources in an unprecedented level, spent $12.4 billion in 4 years to rebuild Europe and many of our former enemies. In today's dollars, that would be 10 times as much in half the time. And I'm afraid that we will rue the day that we did not invest wisely and consistently in trying to transform the Soviet Union. You look at that little chart and look at the deficit spending that was ramped up, in part, in a large measure, because of the Cold War. The best money we're spending is the Nunn-Lugar money, where we're paying the Russians to decommission their nuclear weapons. These are things that I fear that we are missing a profound opportunity to invest in a safer, more economically prosperous world. There were a number of us in this room, as I look around, who joined together for a tribute to Senator Mark Hatfield in his last year in office. It was pretty clear that he wasn't going to run at that point. But Senator Hatfield had weathered a firestorm because he was the only Republican who voted against the balanced budget constitutional amendment. He felt that Congress didn't have the will to actually balance the budget, which they could do just by cutting spending or raising taxes. And he felt it was a cop-out to pass a constitutional amendment that somebody 7 years from now would do what Congress was unwilling to do at the time. In fact, some of you remember he even offered, when some of his Senate colleagues were unhappy with him, he offered his resignation to then Majority Leader Bob Dole. One of the last times I can remember somebody in American politics offering to resign on principle. Well, I think we were all proud of Senator Hatfield for his courage, whether or not we agreed with him at the time, although I think history has proven that he was right in trying to avoid those sorts of gimmicks. But I think that's something that we need to be a part of as we look at this budget process, is being able to celebrate some of those heroes from the past, like Senator Hatfield, who at great personal sacrifice were willing to stand up for what was right in that arcane world of budgetry. And I think unless and until we put the spotlight on it in the future, I don't think we're going to like very much what happens. But of course, I'm an optimist, and I think that we have an opportunity to seize this. And one of the things that I have been encouraged as I've been traveling around the country is that people really are starting to get it. The American priorities are clear. I think there is an opportunity for us to turn this around. And in part, I've been heartened by some of the newer people that I've seen come to Congress in both parties that want to do something a little different. I appreciate the opportunity to share a few moments to give you my projections, predictions, and my biases. And I look forward, as always, to an opportunity to talk about them with you in this next phase of our program.
Representative Blumenauer, I actually have two questions. The first is that the President recently signed a defense spending bill of $289 billion over an $18 billion increase over fiscal year 1999. Did you support that? And second question, Kosovo, we waged an aerial war on Yugoslavia, didn't lose an American serviceman. Tens of thousands of Kosovars, Albanians, and Serbs died. And now we're in a situation, of course, where we see the Albanians having been driven out of the country. They're back. We're seeing revenge. Was our foreign policy, by the time and manner in which we intervened there, a success, or was it a failure?
I appreciate the softball there, Les. We were in the process of playing catch-up at the beginning of this terrible saga this year. And I think it goes back to the beginning of this decade, where there was aggression in other parts of the Balkans, and the United States and other European countries gave signals that were at best equivocal, and it sort of encouraged people to move forward. I fear that I personally think that we would have been better advised to have tried to work more in a multilateral and a multinational context through the United Nations earlier on. I feel a little uncomfortable with the precedent that we abandon the United Nations and that NATO intervenes unilaterally in a situation like this. That being said, I did support the American initiatives as they went forward, because I felt it was important to at least attempt to stop genocide. I feel that we need to be able to be clearer that we are not going to accept the wholesale extermination of thousands or tens of thousands, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of people. I think we fell short of the mark in Rwanda. I've been bitterly disappointed about what's happened in East Timor. I don't think we were nearly aggressive enough with Indonesia. In our worst projections, and some of us talked about that. I had a chance to meet with Mr. Gusmo in prison in Jakarta in January, talking a little about this, meeting with the Indonesian military, and our worst fears were were realized in terms of what's happened to that troubled, soon I hope to be independent country. I think we have to be more consistent over the long haul. We have to use multilateral organizations wherever possible. I think we start with the United Nations. I think we have to be firm that we're going to have a consistent policy against genocide and not send confusing signals that gives people like Milosevic, they think, a license. I felt it was actually a mistake. It may have been wise domestic politics, but I think it was wrong to rule out the possibility of troops on the ground, because I think that sort of prolonged that sort of activity. In retrospect, we didn't lose any casualties, and we sort of had some progress, but it's not unlike the sad state of affairs that we've got in Iraq, where we're in this suspended animation, and we're continuing to have to respond over time without adequate resolution.
Ray Polanyi, a City Club member. Congressman Blumenauer, much is being said all the time about the insolvency of Social Security and Medicare trust funds. And I think what's being forgotten is that there are trust funds, that they have a special tax that pays for them. And I think it all goes back to the Johnson administration including the Social Security Trust Fund in the general budget, mainly to hide the cost of the Vietnam War. So the question is, what is the likelihood of getting the trust fund out of the general budget and let it stand on its own, as it should?
People talk about it. The practical effect, Ray, is that it's not going to make much difference. These are a liability. We right now purchase bonds that are credited towards the Social Security account. I mean, there isn't a separate, Swiss bank that we send this money off into. These are U.S. securities that are a part of it. These are securities that theoretically, at least, are going to be used up. But unless we get our spending in balance, unless we make potentially some structural changes over time with Medicare and Medicaid, it's going to have the same impact. What the danger is that we are distracted by the notion of whether there is a surplus or a deficit. And if we don't get our spending in balance and have the capacity of our government, if our priorities change or the economy tanks, to be able to meet our day-to-day obligation and cut those checks. And I think the accounting is more political at this point than it is real.
John Leeper, City Club member. Two bits of legislation back there that I'd like your perspective on, sir. One is the legislation as it would impact on Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, and the second is the legislation concerning states' rights and the federal disengagement.
I'm not certain I know I have a precise reference for your second piece of legislation.
I have heard that there is legislation under active consideration, or it was in the past, to limit the federal government's role in legislation for things that otherwise could or should be handled by the states. I'm sorry for not articulating it better the first time.
Well, the Death with Dignity is an example of sort of that tension on the federal level. You currently are seeing some of my colleagues who think that states' rights are just fine if it's a way to accomplish their objectives. But if a state happens to do something with which they disagree, then of course they want to have uniform national standards and a preemption. And there's a lot of tension, and this goes back and forth, and actually both parties will flip sides on this. There is no consistent philosophy. What is emerging is very interesting, that this Supreme Court is starting to dramatically restrict the ability of the federal government to enact uniform legislation for the 50 states. And that actually has perhaps the most profound consequences on everything from gun safety to workers' compensation to environmental protection. And I think we're going to see most energy taking place on the Supreme Court level over the course of the next couple of years. There is an active effort underway by some in Congress to overrule the decision that Oregonians have made twice to try and deal with some of these difficult end-of-life decisions. And I would venture there's probably nobody in this room who is not conflicted to some degree about the legislation, about its implementation, about where we go with it. But something I feel very strongly about, that it is wildly inappropriate for this legislation to advance by Senator Hatch and Congressman Henry Hyde. What this would do would subject Oregon physicians to unprecedented scrutiny about their decisions about medication or not at the end of life. Right now, everybody in this room knows that across the country, there are instances where there is, in effect, physician-assisted suicide. It happens in every state, and people acknowledge it. Oregon is the first state that has stepped up to try and provide a framework and some protections and an approach to it. Is it perfect? No. Can we improve it? Probably. Will we? I think so. But there's a profound irony, I think, that if this legislation were enacted, there would only be one state in the union where the federal drug people will be looking over the shoulder of physicians in terms of these end-of-life decisions. And in the other 49 states that don't have a policy framework and haven't worked it through, nobody will be supervising. And I think that that's inappropriate. Oregon physicians right now, you've seen the decision where there was a physician that was sanctioned by the Board of Medical Examiners because they didn't provide enough medication. And then we'll have the drug bureaucrats checking to see if they provided too much. I think that's really an unfortunate situation for our physicians. It's unnecessary, and I hope it doesn't pass.
Bill Connor, City Club member. I wanted to ask you about the role of the federal government in providing adequate housing, particularly for the lowest fifth of the population. The City Club has a special research study going on now, and it's apparent from the witnesses that have testified that we have a lot of people in our community, and I suspect this is true the countrywide, who do not have adequate housing and who are paying up to 50% of income for rent. leaving little else to buy. We're also told that nothing is going to be done in a substantial way unless the federal government restores the funding that used to be available. What are your views on this, and what can we do?
It is an increasing national crisis, and I hear this in California, state of Washington, New York, New England. It's certainly real in our community. Actually, I spent a lot of time sort of scratching my head and talking to Denny West about that this week, and we're proposing that we engage some of the large city housing authorities in a conversation with some of the people who are active with the livable communities activities around the country and the administration. We need to go in one of three directions. First of all, we need to make some adjustments. One option would be to make some adjustments in the current vouchering program, because in a lot of communities it doesn't do any good, even though the number of vouchers has been reduced. The vouchers don't do any good if there isn't anything that they can voucher in terms of having housing that's available to them. The second approach that needs to be taken is maybe looking back at the traditional housing authority structure that we've had around the country, adequately funding it. And we can do this now. We have resources. Instead of gaming the system, you know, the things that I just talked about, we could divert a relatively small percentage of the money that I personally think is not being well spent right now, and be able to revitalize the existing system. The third alternative, and one that has equally, I think, as much promise, and is something that we ought to be discussing here and with the Housing Authority and other certified smart people, is taking the resource base that the public housing authorities represent around the country and basically freeing that up to be used in an entrepreneurial sense, to be able to leverage the money that is there, be able to manage it for the interests of the lower income community. There's a tremendous amount of money potentially that could be used to build housing stock in communities that have existing housing authorities. That wouldn't require a lot of additional money. It just would be free them up, basically, make them autonomous, local, independent housing authorities to spend that capital in ways that would be in the best interests of the community. Any one of those three approaches, I think, would be better than what we are doing now, and it's something that I think Denny and I would look forward to meeting with some of you at the City Club to think about some federal policy and alternatives that could go down one of those three tracks. It's one of the most important things we can do to make sure communities are livable.
Don Smith, City Club member. Congressman, first I'd like to thank you for your positive remarks with regard to the need to look further at our foreign investments. And for pointing out on the sheet how little America does invest overseas, and said another way, that places us about 28th amongst the developed countries of the world in terms of our commitment to developing neighbors and friends abroad for economic and other purposes. My question today has to do with the national debt. Of all of the discussions that have been had with regard to the potential budget surplus, there seems to be little interest amongst the members of Congress to talk about any form of paying down the national debt. Can you talk for a minute about what you see as the implications if we don't make those payments, and as a part of that, what your position is with regard to working on the national debt?
I personally think that one of the good things that's going to come out of the gridlock is that if we can't agree on lots of other spending, the money automatically goes in to buy off the national debt. We're doing it now, and I think that's very positive. If I had my way, I would place that very high on the list of priorities about where we ought to make that investment. We currently have the opportunity, if the economy holds, and if we were to dedicate 2/3 to 3/4 of the surpluses over the next 15 years, we could virtually wipe out the national debt. If we were able to eliminate enough of the debt that would drive down interest rates, say 2%, it's pretty profound what impact that would have on business development, or just in terms of a person who's trying to purchase a home. I think the national average mortgage now is in the neighborhood of $115,000. At 8% over 30 years, the difference between 8% and 6% interest rate would be $186 a month. If the family saved $186 a month and just took that savings and put it in a certificate of deposit at, say, 4.5%, at the end of the 30-year mortgage, they'd have more accumulated than the $115,000 that they started with at the price of the home. It can be very, very significant for American families, for American business, and it will give us capacity if we come up into a time in the future where we do need to deficit finance. The good news is we're going to be buying down the debt because Congress and the President can't figure out any other way to spend the money, and I think that's good. And I'm hopeful that over time we can have a more aggressive program to reduce the debt and be able to provide more opportunities for capital formation for individuals and business.
Thank you very much.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Congressman, as I'm sure you're aware, there are polls showing that many Americans don't have the basic information about the federal budget that you've kindly provided today. For instance, a few years ago, there was a poll showing that most Americans think that foreign aid costs a lot more than Medicare. And I tend to think that has a really distorting impact on the national debate about taxes and services. I also tend to think it's largely the product of a bipartisan conspiracy between Democrats who don't want people to know that the most popular programs cost a lot of money, and Republicans who don't want people to know that most of those evil taxes go to popular programs. The past couple of years, I've managed to talk Channel 2 News here into doing stories, fairly detailed ones, on where your tax dollars go on April 15th. But I haven't been able to talk the Oregonian or many other news outlets into doing that. And I was wondering if you could join me next April in trying to talk at least our local media into doing those kind of stories and explaining to them the importance of people having that information, and maybe generating an Oregonian headline next April 15th saying, "Shocking news for taxpayers. Medicare costs 17 times more than foreign aid."
Well, Steve, I think your efforts are well placed. It is, but it needs not to be something that we do on April 15th, where people are maybe momentarily feeling the pain or their attention is associated with it. Because I do think that day in and day out, we rely on government services. On balance, I think citizens get the government they deserve, and lots of times we get better government than we deserve, maybe, based on how few people invest in that effort. It's been fascinating to me that we in this community can generate such heat over some of the land use and development and transportation issues. And I know Charlie, Bud Clark can think of chapter and verse on some of these things that just come roaring at us. But the mundane aspects of the budget, and particularly when Mayor Clark was putting together some difficult budgets when the economy was just starting to come back, and there were some painful decisions that were made here. It was very hard to engage people, and I don't know any shortcut. It's something I think maybe I've been remiss in not spending more time putting out some of the boring stuff. There may be ways that we can coordinate doing it. I've been impressed with what the city of Portland has done over the last dozen years trying to get budget information out and have budget forums and engage people. But it isn't a hit and miss. The irony is that when people find out what the facts are, they usually feel better. People tell me that we spend too much on foreign aid, and I ask them, well, what percentage of the budget should we spend? And they say, well, it should be cut maybe to 5%. Which is, about 5 times as much as we're spending. And well, I'll tell you what, we'll just do half of that, and everybody will be happy. It's a difficult transition to make, but I look at what happened in East Timor, and maybe I'll conclude on this note. I see Lloyd ready to move, but it struck me that in East Timor, people, over 90% of the people went to vote on the issue of independence when their life was at stake, when people were being killed for voting. And here, when we've got so much information, when there's so much public participation, when there's so many opportunities to influence it, we tend to maybe take it for granted or move on to other parts of our lives. And I'd be willing to brainstorm with you if there are ways to focus on it, but I hope it's not one day out of the year. I think we got to do it on an ongoing basis.